first speaker for today, this evening's event. And she's a very, very powerful woman. You know, she works in tech across various organizations. I mean, personally, I've had experience with her. Personally, I've worked on a project with her. And I mean, she's really, really amazing. She knows her stuff. She knows her onions. And she's somebody who people who wants to get into business should listen to, especially the female folks. She's one of those people who, you know, one of those women whom ladies look up to and they're like, this is the kind of person I want to be, right? Her name is Nkemdilim Begho. And she's currently the CEO of Future Software Resources Limited, one of Nigeria's leading digital and technology solution companies. She provides a broad range of solutions for the scaling of Africa enterprises to consistently attract and retain its targets, to also optimize its processes and increase the bottom line. The interesting thing is that Nkem has been recognized as an Obama African leader. She's also on Forbes top 10 female tech founders in Africa. She's also a global digital woman, top 10. She's also top 10 most inspiring women in Africa. She's the lioness of Africa's top 100. You know, she's just a lot. And she's also Ventures Africa's 42 most innovative Africans. Wow. She currently serves on various private and public sector and listed company boards, including Stanbic IBTC Holdings PLC, Novware Investment Fund, and so on. And she's here today with us, and she's ready to, you know, dish us and give to us information that will help us, you know, thrive in our business. She's here to talk to us on how to build and, you know, how to build and sustain, or she's here to talk to us on navigating uncertainty, strategies for building resilient businesses. So, ladies and gentlemen, before she begins with a round of applause, even though we cannot hear you, and a standing ovation, even though we cannot see you, I want you to welcome Nkemdilim Begho. You're very welcome, Ma.
Thank you so much, Desmond. Thank you for that very glorious introduction.
Thank you very much, Ma.
So I'm gonna share. Can you please allow me to share so that I can share my slides?
All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. Like Desmond said, my name is Nkemdilim Begho, and I am going to try and talk about, you know, sort of strategies for building businesses in difficult times, right? I think especially the last few years have been very difficult for most businesses. And this year doesn't seem to be any different, right? I think the inflation rate is really, really high. You know, we've had different types of crisis in country. We had a fuel crisis, we had a cash crisis. You know, I think just generally, you know, a lot of people are leaving the country as well. So we also have a, you know, sort of a jackpot kind of crisis. So I think that there's a lot going on for anyone who is trying to build a business, right? And I don't know, you know, sort of like what stage you guys are at in terms of building the business, right? But basically, I think these things are really across board, whether you have a small business or, you know, you're, you know, sort of speaking to a really large business. The strategies are not that different, right? So you may think, oh, but it's only big businesses that, you know, need some of these things. The truth is that it's any kind of business that, you know, really needs to understand, like, what am I supposed to even look at, right? And how can I, you know, sort of make sure that I'm doing the right thing? And I'll try and just give some examples from the different types of experiences that I have. And please, if you have any questions, you know, sort of feel free to put the questions in the chat as we go on, and then I'll try and address them as I'm speaking. Okay. So I'm sort of going to talk about, you know, uncertain times, but then also the emergence of the digital economy, and what we need to do to sort of embrace both, and then what, you know, sort of like the recommendations for businesses would look like. So I think there's sort of two things that happening, right? So there's like the tail end of the global pandemic. The WHO today finally declared COVID a thing of the past, right? And in as much as it may not have affected Nigeria in terms of health issues and deaths and things like that, it affected us in many other ways, right? And I think from a global perspective, you know, it was a massive disruption of business as usual, right? So like my team, for example, we still work completely remotely, and we just basically are now a virtual organization. And we have got a distributed team with people in like 5 different locations. Before the pandemic, that wouldn't have been, you know, sort of, we wouldn't have imagined it really, especially for a small kind of team. But it's basically sort of shaken a lot of things up. It also caused global supply chain disruptions, right? So if you were trying to order a computer in the last, you know, few years, you'd probably have had issues or long wait times. You know, like I tried to order a Mac and it was like 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes depending on which store you're trying to buy from, 12 weeks wait time, right, for a computer. And that doesn't make any sense. But the reason behind that is that their global supply chain was completely disrupted and they couldn't produce enough for the demand that they're facing, right? A lot of industries also sort of crumbled, right? Or got really weak when you think about the lockdown that lasted really long in some countries. I think we were very lucky. You know, when I talk to my friends that live abroad, I'm always like, you know what, we're actually very lucky how we handled COVID in Nigeria, because other countries really had major restrictions, and it affected so many industries, especially hospitality, travel, you know, and fitness industry and stuff like that. Anything that required sort of like close contact, right, was really disrupted in many ways. It also created economic instability, right, because the different governments pumped a lot of, you know, sort of, I guess, relief funds into the economy, right, which then made stocks go up, right? So when you look at during the pandemic, especially tech stocks were massively high. And now they've all crashed, right? But have they really crashed, or have they just gone back to where they were before? Because there's no more, you know, sort of like, first of all, rapid growth, and then there's also no support from governments that inflate revenues and bottom lines and stuff like that. High levels of inflation and financial volatility, I think that's one thing that we've really seen here in Nigeria. You know, like in the last probably 24 months, our exchange rate has gone from 365 to 700 and, you know, 60 and above. And this is really difficult, especially when you're running a tech kind of driven business, because a lot of your technology expenses are in dollars, right? We're also not able to use Nigerian cards, which means that you need to find alternatives. You need to figure out like how you get money out, or how to use, you know, a virtual card. And I think that a lot of the fintechs are solving that problem for us, but it's still not as, you know, sort of easy and straightforward. And obviously the operational costs are through the roof, right? So my accountant keeps saying, like, why is your operational cost rising every month? And I said, no, it's not. It's exactly the same as it was. The problem is that the exchange rate is rising and our costs are in dollars, right? Then there's also a lot of uncertainties across industries and sectors. And I think, you know, we're seeing sort of like the ripple effect of that, even within big tech globally, where Microsoft is letting go, Amazon is letting people go, you know, Google, all of the big tech companies are, you know, firing people. And that will have a really big ripple effect. And then we're also seeing things like the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, right? In as much as, you know, you feel like, oh, well, but that's in Silicon Valley, it's not a big deal. But the truth is that a lot of the, you know, sort of funds that invest on the continent had their money in there, and that's all gone. So investments are going to slow down. There's also a lot of, you know, sort of Delaware corps that were registered by African founders that were in that bank. That's also gone, right? A lot of that will not be recovered. So there is a ripple effect, and it does affect us, right? Because we live in this global economy. A lot of these things that seem far away actually have really big sort of macro, you know, effects on what we do here, right? So I think in the next couple of months, it will be harder to raise money. And, I think we'll just see a lot of the sort of venture money that's been floating around slow down a little bit. Then I think also there's this accelerated digital transformation, right? So there's the rise of Web 3.0. So whether it's sort of blockchain, smart contracts, tokenization, the metaverse, that entire sort of concept of how web works, and especially with artificial intelligence that I think has taken center stage in this year, is flipping things on the head, right? And it will lead to more jobs being lost, right? It will also lead to certain jobs being made completely redundant because they can be replaced with technology. But it also means that your consumer behavior is changing, right? Which means that you really need to look at how can you be consumer-centric? How can you make sure that you have solutions that are personalized? How can you make sure that your communication to your customers is personalized, right? Then you also need to make sure that all your transactions are accessible digitally, right? In today's world, no one is going to hear, okay, send a letter, then we'll send you a paper with information, right? Everybody wants an app. Everybody wants to know, okay, if I do X, Y, Z, what's going to happen? There's basically a need for companies to really adapt for a digital future. But it also means that you're exposed to more risks, right? Especially around data and cyber. Those are big risks that every business owner really needs to sort of plan for. So in business, there's a term called VUCA. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? And especially, I think, during the pandemic, this was one of the terms that you heard every single day. But basically, in a VUCA world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, as many would characterize today's global environment, right? Especially with sort of like the war in the Russia-Ukraine war, that skyrocketed diesel prices, that skyrocketed flour prices, that skyrocketed bread prices, right? There's so many global dependencies that we don't necessarily see, right? So we're like, okay, they're fighting there, who cares? We're here, we have our own stuff to deal with. But the truth is that it impacts us in many ways, right? If the diesel prices go up, it means cost of doing business goes up, right? Or it means that you may not have electricity as frequent as you need it. But basically, in this type of world, strategy matters more than ever, right? And I think that a lot of the time as a small business, we focus more on the operational than on strategy. And I think that for me is sort of like what I want to focus on today, right? How do you embrace uncertainty? First of all, you need to be agile as an organization, right? So you need to be able to shapeshift. You need to be able to really just pivot and reinvent yourself over and over again. And I've been running my company for 15 years. And, I think what I've realized is that you never stop evolving, right? And at every stage, you need something different, and you need to be flexible. You need to be agile. You need to know when it's time to move in a certain direction, when it's time to slow down, when it's time to accelerate. You also need to, I think in that type of world where every single day there's a new thing that's happening, right? So, when we entered January, there was talk about, okay, by 15th of January, the new notes would be in circulation, this and that. I don't think that anyone really envisioned what that would cause, and the kind of mayhem that the aftermath of that was, right? There were bank branches burnt down because the banks didn't have cash, and people were like, I deposited my money here. Give me my money back in new notes, because that is what I came here for. I don't do digital transactions, right? People that remove their clothes in banks, people that climbed on top of the bank and all sorts of different things, right? But that just shows you that it's really hard to plan in the long term, right? So a lot of the time, investors will ask you for your 5-year plan, projections, this and that. Yeah, you need to put that on paper. But the truth is that most businesses don't follow any of that, right? Because that is really becoming obsolete. And businesses are really rethinking how they plan and how also closely they track their strategies, right? And how they review strategies pretty much in real time. You also have to, look at what are the most salient uncertainties for your industry and business, and define your organizational risk appetite, right? So how much risk are you willing to take? And what do these risks mean for you, right? If there's a policy change, for example, right? And it can be little things, right? Like I talked about, not being able to use Nigerian cards online, right? So what is the risk of that, right? It means that you are exposed to the risk that you may not be able to continue paying for your services if you can't find an alternative, right? So how do you find an alternative? If there were no virtual cards, what would you do? It means that you need to figure out how you can earn in dollars so that you can have a dollar card to actually fund, the expenses that you have. Or it means that you need to figure out where you can source dollars that can be inflow so that you can use your dollar card. So either way, that is a risk for your business, right? Then you need to sort of stress test these different scenarios, right? So you look at what are the risks, what are the opportunities, and then sort of like say, what is the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? And what's sort of like the scenarios in between, right? Based on the different risks that you have. Also look at what role data plays in all of this, right? How can you use data that you've created or, collected in your organization to make predictions about what the future holds, right? So this is an election year. In election years, businesses usually in the first 2 quarters slow down significantly because cash flow from government into the private sector slows down, right? Which means that if you have usually this type of funnel where government throws money in and the big corporates mop that money up, and then the big corporates pay the medium-sized businesses pay the smaller businesses pay the micro businesses, and then it goes to that one-man business. That's not happening at the moment, right? And it's not going to happen until after swearing in, after sort of everything is settled a little bit more. So that's going to take us at least into the end of Q2, right? So you also need to think about what does that mean for your business and how do you plan for those type of times of uncertainty. And then real-time tracking and monitoring of the economy and the industry, because there's so much stuff that's going on, tracking of policies, what those policies mean for your business, right? So if tomorrow they say, okay, we're banning petrol or we're removing subsidy, what does that mean for your business, right? It means that your staff, so if the cost of fuel goes from 184 or 85 naira to 750 naira, right, which is the projection that is out there, what happens, right? It means that you have a 6x cost for transportation. If you have a small gen, it means you have a 6x cost of operational costs that are electricity focused, right? It means that if you run a logistics business, you have 6x cost of delivery, which will you be able to pass that on to your customer, right? And if you're passing it on to your customer, how do you do that? How do you make sure that you're communicating proactively? If this thing happens, if you wake up tomorrow and this has happened, what do you do, right? So you need to also be clear on sort of macroeconomic issues and really understand, how those impact your or can impact your business. So business models that were once considered rock solid are also becoming very obsolete, right? And there's a new generation of consumers that is emerging that has very different needs, very different demands, and very different expectations. So you also need to build sort of for the future while being able to service the past. I think at this point, there are probably 5 different generations that most organizations service, right? And that's very difficult because you have, like if you look at a bank, for example, they have customers who are in their 80s. They don't really know how to use the technology, right? Then you have customers in like their 60s, right, that are about to retire. Then you've got people in their 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, and then you've got children. You have to have offerings for each of these segments. People are living longer, which means that the cross-generational sort of spectrum is increasing and growing. The generations are very different in their needs, in their wants, in their habits, in the expectations that they have of your customer experience and your customer service, the channels that you have available for them and things like that, right? So you really need to think about like, how do I actually service this multitude of customers without, causing issues or without losing an important customer group, right? So you need to service backwards to make sure that you keep existing customers, but you need to service forward to make sure that you can acquire new customers. So in all of that, I think digital really plays the biggest role. And I would say that, you have to have some level of a digital transformation strategy. You need to understand changing consumer behavior. And you can do that by just looking at your customers or engaging with your customers, talking to your customers. You need to be clear on cybersecurity and data, and that has to sort of be incorporated in your business strategy, right? And also in your risk profile. So what happens if you get hacked tomorrow, right? What does that mean for your business if there's suddenly ransomware on your website, right? What happens then, right? What happens if you have a data breach and personal data is leaked, right? There's a Nigerian data protection law, that NDPR, that protects data of individuals. What if that's suddenly leaked? What do you do? What is the plan, right? Do you have a plan? Then also really thinking about what is the digital customer experience, right? So in as much as, I don't know, maybe some of you have brick and mortar businesses, but really thinking through, is there an element of digital that you need to embed into those businesses? If there is, what does that look like and how do you do that? And really look at what are the trends of disruption, right? So I mentioned that there are business models that are being completely disrupted, right? And there's some really interesting books on exactly how these models are being disrupted. But my favorite sort of example that everyone gets, no matter who the audience is Uber, right? So if you go back 6-7 years, or yeah, probably maybe a little bit more, 8 years, there was no Uber in Nigeria, right? So if you needed a car to take you somewhere, a taxi, you would either walk to where the taxi stand is. You may have the number of Red Cab and call them. There was also another one, Lagos Cab or something like that, right? So those were sort of the alternatives, right? Or you have a car hire guy that you have booked in advance that will come to your house and pick you up, right? So those were the ways of, sort of getting a cab. Today, no one would walk to any taxi stand that is far away. No one would, sort of like go and look for the car hire guy if you know that you can just get an Uber quickly, right? Or a Bolt or whatever it is. And that is the change in customer behavior, right? So the customer is not going to go back to status quo. So even if the government said we're banning all of this, you will see that there will be ways that the customers will put pressure to make sure that it doesn't get completely banned. And that means that you really need to understand what is disruption, how does that work? How does it disrupt the ecosystem? Keep an eye on that startup ecosystem. Look at the role of, sort of emerging technology around AI, what's happening with Web3, NFTs, tokenization, what's happening in the crypto space and stuff like that. All of these things are going to, over time, completely disrupt and completely change financial services. And once financial services is completely disrupted and changed, it will trickle down to all other industries. And, these are things that when you sort of look at historic business data, you would see that this is not a one-off occurrence. It's something that's happened over time, many times. How do you also internally sort of focus on innovative and customer-centric solution? And how do you make sure that you've sort of automated all of your operations, right? And that digital really drives that. So during time of crisis or uncertainty, CEOs and executives have a really big role to play in ensuring that organizations are led effectively to implement processes, governance, and risk models that can react to changing environments, right? So many of you may not have a board, right? But it's one of those things that investors are, very keen to see. So you may want to really understand, what does corporate governance actually mean? A lot of you may not have, sort of well-defined processes. But the truth is that you can never start too early, right? To have real clarity about your processes, especially as people are leaving in droves, right? And really thinking about how you can also automate some of that, right? So business strategy in today's world has to focus on risk oversight, right? So I always tell my team, right, we need to be clear on what are our risks, right? What are systemic risks that are just ecosystem risks? What are the risks that are social, right? If there's if that cash crisis had ended up being some kind of big protest or riots or a lot of violence, how does that affect or impact your business, right? how do you also make sure that, like in your workforce, you're treating the people well? You're, sort of like reaching out to the community around you as well. And obviously you then still have like your normal threats, right? Cybersecurity, supply chain disruptions, and, just socioeconomic disruptions. And then you need to focus on establishing organizational agility. So shift your approach from hindsight to foresight, because change is happening so fast that you can't continue to do things the way you do them today, right? You need to always be sort of like a step ahead, or at least know what is happening and what are the trends saying, what are you seeing, ensure accountability and oversee your company's tax policies, right? To also make sure that you are compliant, because everything is being automated now. And, like if you're not actually remitting and paying tax, then, like over time it accumulates and backfires. And then, you have all sorts of liabilities that become an issue in the future. So making sure that you're compliant is very important. Assessing digital related risks and looking at, okay, how do we comply with cybersecurity and IT data protection laws? Understand your customer, what customer satisfaction means to them. And really look at how do you deliver that seamless digital customer experience, right? And how do you make sure that your customer experience is, sort of the same online and offline, right? So sometimes you have really, good experience, or you may have a good product, right? And my favorite example for that is there's this company, they're called Firewood Rice, and they sell rice, right? They're on Instagram, but their customer service is just really poor, and the technology that they've built is really poor, and the customer experience is really poor, right? So they will tell you in the DM, oh, go to this link and place your order. When you get there, it says it's sold out, and then you try and order. So they're like, oh, you have to come back early in the morning. So you wake up really early to place this order. You try and order, then the payment doesn't work. Then nobody's there to confirm, or you've paid and then they didn't deliver the rice, or they didn't place the order. So they're all over the place, right? But their product is really good, right? Their food tastes amazing, but just their customer experience is really bad. The truth is that the customers who go to their store to purchase are probably the ones that still get some kind of service, but online is just not working for them at all, which means that they also really need to look at that. Closing the skills gap and upskilling your board, your management team, your larger team, in line with new business and consumer needs, as well as digital and innovation and disruption, right? So just making sure that the people in your organization understand what is happening, in terms of disruption from a, sort of macroeconomic standpoint, but also from a technology standpoint. Building your organization in a way that it's able to absorb shocks, right? So during COVID, for example, there was like this talk about how much runway do you need in your business, right? And it said you need to build reserves that can last you up to 18 months, right? Which means that you need enough money in the bank to run for 18 months without making any income. And that's very difficult in a country like Nigeria, right? Because we don't have, sort of properly structured credit facilities. We don't have, properly structured overdraft and stuff like that. Which means that most people are bootstrapping, even the ones that have funding. A lot of those businesses are not making money yet. So how do you make sure that you can absorb those type of shocks that really disrupt and push you to completely different direction? And how do you just make sure that you're ready for the next pandemic, you're ready for a natural disaster, you're ready for regulation, policy changes, you're ready for a cybersecurity incident, you're ready for technology failures, right? So when we look at, the banking industry, the cash crisis led to a lot of their systems failing, right? And there's one particular bank that is red, that still has these issues and has been having these issues sort of like even yesterday, their data center caught fire. And it is very unfortunate, right? Because a lot of people and a lot of organizations bank with them, but they're moving away, right? Simply because the technology is not reliable and it's not working. There are too many technology failures. There's too many issues. So people are going to say, this can be my secondary bank. I'm going to create a new account with a primary bank and use that because their technology is better, right? So it's really, really important to, sort of make sure that we are clear on it takes just like this and you lose your customers, right? It's not something that, like happens slowly. Sometimes it can happen overnight. So just really being clear on the risk of that and the role that the technology plays and what kind of third-party dependencies do you have, right? So a lot of the banks, the reason why a lot of the transfers were not working, POSs were not working, was not because of the bank infrastructure. It was because NIBS wasn't working, right? NIBS wasn't working, InterSwitch wasn't working. So there were no switches that were available. And that's why the entire, infrastructure collapsed. But obviously, it's the bank's reputation that is out there, and they can't say, well, oh, but it's NIBS or it's InterSwitch, right? They can just, sort of focus on how do you communicate to your customer to say, we're sorry, right? And we're working on it and we will serve you better. So it's really difficult sometimes, Yeah, so emerging trends in business include a considerable and renewed focus on sustainability. So that's sort of really the buzzword of 2023. I think sustainability, ESG, sort of like technology governance, stakeholder management, gender diversity, digital transformation. Those are all sort of really in the business community, the big, sort of buzzwords that are guiding decisions that are being made. So what are the recommendations here, right? Overall, you need to be ready for, sort of making sure that you understand the risks, that you create scenarios, and you can have a plan for each of the different scenarios. You need to embrace the digital age, right? So you need to upskill, you need to have a digital strategy, you need to understand customer experience, you need to have digital solutions, you need to be able to react swiftly to policy changes and regulatory intervention, because there's going to be more and more of that as technology evolves. You have to take into account multiple stakeholder interests, right? So sometimes in a business, there are people and outside forces that can really disrupt your business and really, sort of put you at an even bigger risk, right? So you need to understand who are all the stakeholders that I engage with and how do I interact with them? What kind of information do I need to share with them in a proactive manner in order to make sure that I'm mitigating against any kind of risk, whether this is reputational risk or financial risk or any other risk, right? Then you have to make sure that there's sort of some level of continuous learning and development, right? And all of this stuff sounds like, oh my God, but I'm this small business. I don't have time to think about all of this stuff. But the truth is, if you don't start thinking about this stuff, right, you will continue to focus on the operational and you will never focus on the strategic. And the minute that the operational, gets halted or there's some kind of disruption, the business is dead, right? Diversity and inclusion is important across board, right? So you need to think about, what does diversity mean for us here on the continent, right? Is it gender diversity? Is it ethnic diversity? Is it by state? What does the diversity mean for your organization? And how do you create that in a very intentional manner, right? How do you make sure that you also start making decisions that are led by D&I, right? How do you make sure that you align the decision-making to the company's purpose and the key stakeholders? And then ESG, as I mentioned, is one of the sort of big buzzwords of 2023, environmental, social, corporate governance. It's basically becoming more and more relevant. And why? Right? So in today's world, if you wanted to, let's say you have an oil and gas company, right? Chances are you're not going to get financing from any bank, because the banks need to report on ESG. They need to reduce the net carbon footprint. They need to make sure that they're no longer lending to organizations that are increasing that carbon footprint. So that race to net zero is real, and it's really important that you start understanding that. Same thing with social issues. You can't sort of treat your workers badly and nothing will happen, right? Social media has such a big role to play in that, right? And I think last year we had, a lot of tech companies being, said to be very toxic environments, the owners to, be involved in all sorts of sexual harassment, shouting, and things like that. So you really need to look at that. And then looking at governance, right? So do you have a board? What kind of structures do you have in place? Do you have compliance in the industry that you're in? Are you regulated? Are you not? Is there reporting that you need to do that you haven't started doing? Are you compliant with your taxes and stuff like that? So it's really important to, sort of look at all of those things. So I will end here and take any questions that you may have.
All right. Thank you very much. So if you have any questions, just I think you should just raise your hands, and so we can. Or you just type it on the chat box. So are there any questions? I don't think I can see everybody. Or do you want us to move the questions to the end of the second session so we can have it like a panel session?
I think it would be better to ask questions now because I actually need to jump off.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So guys, if you have questions, okay, go ahead.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So just state your name.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ma, for the presentation. My name is Peace Adeboye, and like what you've taught us is a lot. I mean, a lot of things I never even thought of concerning my business. Now, my business is just like coming up, and like you've told us about considering risk and the rest. And I was thinking of like someone ordered for some things and I want to like produce more before the person places the next order. And there's a risk of either I making profits from making more than enough or I losing. So how do we measure the risk that we take at every point in time?
I think it's to really use the data that you have, right? And especially in like a production business, right? There's always a risk, right? You buy one pattern and then nobody likes it and everybody's like, this thing is so ugly. But you've bought like 100 yards and you've produced 100 different outfits from it. And then, you sit on your stock. What do you do, right? So that's why the scenario planning is so important, right? To really say, okay, this 100 pieces of clothes cost me, I don't know, 1 million naira, right? To produce. So your risk exposure is 1 million naira, right? At that point, right? So you then have to look at what is the risk appetite that I have as a business, right? How much risk do I really want to take? How much risk can the business even carry, right? Because if that's your last 1 million naira, then probably not a great idea to produce the 100 pieces, right? And you may want to look at how can I produce smaller quantities and, sort of de-risk, right? So that's one, right? To really look at the scenario planning. The second thing is to use your historical data to look at customer behavior and stuff like that. So I have a company where we produce baby products and we use Ankara material, right? And we've been running this since 2013. And, when we started, we said, oh, our target audience is parents. And, by the time we analyzed our data after year one, we didn't have any parents that were our customers, right? We had grandparents, we had uncles, aunties, friends, people who give gifts, right? Parents started becoming our customers probably from year two, right? When we had sold a significant amount of those products to people who were gifting them. The parents then came back and said, do you have this in a bigger size? I got this as a gift. It's fantastic. I love it. It looks beautiful and it's very functional and the quality is good, but it's too small. I need a bigger size, right? So then you now say, okay, do we now go and just only produce the big ones? No, you still figure out, like you need to read the data, right? So over time, you need to look at trends, right? How quickly do you sell out, right? What channels do you sell out on? How quickly can you produce stuff again, right? So sometimes, we may, be sold out, but because we know we can produce, we're not really afraid, right? So we can say, oh, but we're sold out in this color, but we can take orders and you can get it in the next 3 days. Does that work for you? And if they say no, then we can still produce overnight, right? So it's really about, sort of like, how well do you know your business model? How well do you know your customers? What are the things that you can put in place to sort of accommodate, sort of like, your customers in the right type of way.
All right, thank you. So, Peace, that answers your question, yeah?
Yes, ma. Thank you very much, ma.
All right.
Right.
So, are there any follow-up, any other questions from anybody in the room?
Yes, there's a question. Desmond.
All right. So, who's speaking?
It's Chikeluban Bada.
All right. Please go ahead.
All right. I have a question. I intend launching a restaurant in a month's time, but I only have the capital to start up the business, and I only have a capital to start up the business, and I'm looking at how to manage the staff that are going to work with me. Because if I only have the capital for just the business and the space, and I know that in the next 6 months, I don't think I'll be able to stabilize myself very well before. So how do I manage the fact that I'm going to pay the staff that are going to work with me, the people that are going to work with them, without me having issues in between? I don't know. I'm trying to.
So I think the question is, do you have to have a physical space to start with if you don't have enough money, right? So if you don't have runway for a year, at least, why are you starting with a physical space, right? I think we need to really think about business models out of the box. There are many people who run food businesses that have no space, no restaurant space, right? Because with a restaurant space, there come additional operational costs, right? So if I just, sort of like have my kitchen and I can take orders and I do catering and I do, sort of maybe like smaller type of events or, meals for people who are just too busy to, cook for themselves, but that have enough spending power to buy stuff on a daily basis, or, or maybe there are some offices near you that you can go there and you can say, oh, we have this lunch menu, you can order. If you order one day ahead, like we'll deliver it at 12 o'clock every day, and then you just take the orders like that, grow your cash flow, grow your revenue, look at what people even like, right? I think if you don't have investors and you don't have, sufficient startup capital, then why are you going the brick and mortar route immediately, right? I think it's really important to just really understand what that even means, right? Have you done your cash flow projections? Have you done, sort of your operational, do you understand your operational expenses, right? What is your CapEx? What is your OpEx? Are you clear on that, right? Because sometimes, we're like, oh yeah, okay, I have 10 million naira, I can set up this restaurant. By the time the guy who comes to do your tiles now comes to tell you that, Oga, the tiles are now 5 times more the price. But you don't want to now go and buy the cheap ones because then you will retire in a few months, right? Then the person with the chairs comes and tells you that, okay, chairs don't cost, right? Then, and it keeps going. And by the time, you open, you've spent all the money, but you have no money to even buy the ingredients to cook any meals, right? So it's really important to just make those projections, assess the risk, and then also ask yourself, is there another way to start this business, right? Is there a way to get proof of concept, right? So in technology, we call it MVP, most viable, minimum viable product, right? Wow. An MVP is basically the most basic version of what it is that you're trying to do, right? So sometimes you see apps and you're like, okay, I can only do this one thing on the app, but then it has other buttons and it says coming soon, coming soon. It's not that these people have not thought about these things. They don't have money to build those things. And they need to see that this first thing that they're building, people need it before they know that they can build the other things, and they need to make more money, or they need to convince investors by showing traction that they can. Because if you come to an investor and you say, okay, I want to start this restaurant, the first thing they will ask you, what's your track record? Do you have restaurant management skills? Do you have, like hospitality background? What do you know about the restaurant business? Can we see your 5-year projections? Can we, sort of understand how this is going to work? What's the projected revenue? What's this? What's that? And you won't have answers, right? So it's important that you really have clarity and you really sort of build out the business plan, build out the business model. Make sure that you are clear on risks, right? It's clear on what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, what are threats, and where do I see opportunities? So do a SWOT analysis about the business, and always ask yourself, is there a different way of doing this, right? So I used to have very small clients with very small budgets, and they would be like, oh, I want to do this. And I said, that's for rich people. If you have money, you can do it, right? I said, but you don't. So we need to find the poor man creative way of doing it, right? So just because you don't have money doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means that you can't do it the way that other people do it. And it means that you need to maybe think about a different way of doing things and a different way of achieving the same goal or a similar goal, right? Or just even completely disrupting that business model and doing something completely different that no one else is doing yet, right? And that is how disruption happens, right? The story of Uber is the two founders were in Paris in the cab line waiting for a cab, and they were like, won't it be great if we can use our phone to call a cab? Then they went back to America and said, let's build this thing, right? They said, if we need this, other people need it too, right? Mm-hmm. And that's how they built it. And now it's a global product, right? So sometimes, like also being bold and just, like trusting that, your idea is actually good, and trusting that there is a different way to do it, right? In Nigeria, sometimes we get boxed in, they said that we have to do it like this. That's why we're doing it like that. But no, we don't have to do anything. You always have a choice, right? So you can choose how to do things, and you can try and do things differently.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ma. So I'm just going to take these last two questions from these two people, and then we'll move to the next item on our agenda. So when next we call for questions, please, be a leader. A leader is someone that takes initiative. So take initiative, be the first person, maybe wait for others to join. So the next question says, good evening, Ma. My name is Silas. So question is, I'm currently running a shoemaking business right now, but it's not registered. So my question is, how can I make it up to my audience when I want to register a business name that is not my current business name? Okay, how can I make it up to my customer? So I want to register my business name, but it's like I get to see a CA.
Why are you registering a name is it that the name is already taken? Maybe.
So it's asking, right, can I register a business name and then have a subsidiary retirement name?
If the name is not registered, it's not a subsidiary, right? So I think we need to be very clear on, sort of like these words that we throw around, right? If it's not registered, it's not a subsidiary, right? So it could be a product name, which you can register as a trademark, for example. You can register as a brand name. But these things take time, right? So brand marks, trademarks, like 2, 3, 4, 5 years that you'd be chasing, sort of the name. And it doesn't necessarily give you a lot of guarantees, right? So it's important to make sure that you actually register a limited liability company, right? So that you have the actual business name. So if, let's say, currently I'm operating as Nkem Shoes, but then I go to CAC and Nkem Shoes is already taken. So I'm like, okay, maybe I'll call it Nkemdilim Shoes, right? And then I'm able to register that, right? The existing customers that I have, right? I would have their phone numbers, their WhatsApps, maybe email addresses, right? Then I could create, if I already have a logo with Nkem Shoes, I can create a second new logo and with Nkemdilim Shoes and say, Nkem Shoes is now Nkemdilim Shoes. We're evolving, we're rebranding, create a brand story around it, create some kind of narrative and communication around why this evolution is happening. You're growing up, you're making the business more structured, and you want to celebrate with your customers and you're giving them a 10% discount. So that way you've done two things, right? You're driving sales, but you're also communicating with the customers and they're engaged because there's also a benefit to them. So I hope that sort of answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. All right. So the last question for this session is going to be, Do you have a book recommendation that would help us understand this concept better? I remember you were saying something about the book the other time.
Yeah, so I think the digital transformation playbook is one of my, sort of favorite books around sort of the way that digital is disrupting. It has a lot of really interesting case studies and also a lot of stories about how different businesses that did not see disruption coming actually died. And I think that there are many lessons to sort of be learned in that. I can send a couple of books to Desmond, and he can then share with everyone who has registered or signed up for this. Yeah, and then you can have a look at those books. There's also another really good book. It's called The Entrepreneurial Roller Coaster, which basically also just talks about entrepreneurship and the kind of roller coaster journey it is, and the type of things that you encounter and how you can go from zero to hero, but you can also go from hero to zero. I also would recommend to read a lot of, sort of biographies or autobiographies of people who've built big businesses. One of my favorites is Shoe Dog Millionaire, which is the story of the Nike founder, Phil Knight. Elon Musk, the story of Elon Musk, written by Vance Ashley, is also a really good read. I also really like 50 Cent's Hustle Harder, or something like that book. It's basically his story, and it's really, really interesting. And like we see 50 Cent as like this gangster rapper who used to sell drugs, but 50 Cent is a businessman through and through, right? And he's very intentional. Every single thing that he's done is intentional, right? So you feel like he's, okay, he's representing a vodka company, this and that, different things. The man doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, doesn't do drugs, right? He says, if I do those things, I'll be distracted and I won't be able to focus on my business. He's like, so when you see me in the club, there's water in my glass, right? And that's it, So, and it's that discipline, right? The discipline, and he talks a lot about discipline. Even in his selling drugs, he talks about selling drugs and the discipline that it requires, and this, sort of like the business model behind it, right? And how it was very calculated. And he was like, I'm going to do this for X amount of time, and then I need to get out, right? And now, he's just bought, 9,000 square feet, a place to build like G-Unit studios, right? Massive, massive, massive for production. When you look at what he's built out of, Power, the series, he's pretty much built six different sub-series out of that, right? He's built pretty much his own, sort of network for distribution. So, I think we can learn from many different walks of life, because not everyone is walking the same walk that we're walking. So I really recommend to, sort of pick up books like that, to read them and to just learn the lessons, note the lessons, and really sort of think about how can I apply them in my own business, right? And then I think also books around, sort of personal development and, sort of like, and just, I guess, also principles of life, right? So one book that I really like is The Compound Effect, where it just really tells you, like how, they say 10 years of hard work makes you an overnight success, right? But that's really the sort of compound effect, right? Where you keep doing, and at some point it clicks, right? But it's not overnight, it doesn't happen, immediately. You need to put in the work, and there's no shortcuts to success. But I'll send some of these things to Desmond, and then you guys can, sort of read and hopefully you find things that will help you on your journey of building your business.